Let me add my voice to my many predecessors here as session chairs in welcoming all of you to Brown University. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces here and to meet so many new people over the course of this tremendous conference. I also, of course, want to add my congratulations to the conference organizers. This is a truly stupendous event, a testament to, of course, the JCB, but to the remarkable range of scholarship that's being done in the Academy right now. And it's been an incredibly edifying experience to be a member or a participant in this conference. The panel that we are about to join is the Landscapes of Labor panel. And if you remember yesterday, Jack Crowley mentioned that in the landscapes of sugar, labor is largely invisible. Labor plays a background role to the machinery, to the technologies of sugar processing. And while the papers at this conference have by no means replicated that, we've heard a great deal, in fact, over the last 2 days about laboring people in the fields and processing of sugar. This panel is going to make it even more explicit and bring our attention precisely to the way in which work worked in the early modern sugar economy. We have 4 speakers today, and I'm going to give you a brief introduction to each of them. They will speak in succession, keeping to the strict 20 minutes that they have been allocated. And then we will move to the table and be happy to take questions and answers. Our session begins with Lydia Pulsipher, who's a professor emerita of geography at the University of Tennessee. She's the recipient of the Preston E. James Eminent Latin Americanist Career Award from the Conference of Latin Americanist Geographers, as well as the National Mentor of the Year Award from the National Council on Geographic Education. Pulsipher is best known for her work on the Galways, a Montserrat sugar plantation whose history was recounted in a major Smithsonian Museum of Natural History exhibition in the early 1990s. Pulsipher's long-standing work in the historical geography and archaeology of the Eastern Caribbean has also informed a range of other projects dealing with questions of modern economic development, tourism, and the particular challenges of historical recovery in the wake of the volcanic destruction of research sites. Our second speaker today is Louis Nelson, the Associate Dean for Research and International Programs in the School of Architecture at the University of Virginia. For the last decade, he has directed the university's Historic Preservation Field School in Falmouth, Jamaica, and he has served as the co-editor until this year of Buildings and Landscapes, the Journal of the Vernacular Architectural Forum. Nelson has published widely on material religion, including the 2009 book, The Beauty of Holiness, Anglicism and the Architecture in colonial South Carolina. He's also the co-editor with Maury McInnes of the 2011 volume, Shaping the Body Politic, Art and Political Formation in Early America. He's currently working on a monograph that is in fact close to being done and from which he'll be presenting today, entitled Architecture and Empire in Early Jamaica. Our third presenter today is Francisco A. Scarano, a native of Puerto Rico and professor of history and director of the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He completed his studies at Duke University and took his PhD from Columbia University and is the author of several important works for the purposes of this conference, including Sugar and Slavery in Puerto Rico, The Plantation Economy of Ponce, 1800 to 1850, published in 1984 by University of Wisconsin Press, in addition to Colonial Crucible, Empire in the Making of the Modern American State, published in 2009, co-edited with Alfred McCoy, and most recently, The Caribbean, A History of the Region and Its Peoples, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2011. Our final speaker in this session today is my colleague Evelyn Hu-DeHart, who earned her degrees from Stanford and the University of Texas at Austin, where she specialized in Latin American and Caribbean history. She has also been the recipient of an honorary Doctor of Laws degree from the University of Notre Dame, and here at Brown she serves as Professor of History, American Studies, and Ethnic Studies. After turning her dissertation on the Yaqui Nation in New Spain, Mexico, and the US-Mexican borderlands into 3 books, one of which was in Spanish, Hu-DeHart has now turned her attention to researching, narrating, and documenting the stories of Chinese migrants to Latin America and to the Caribbean, and she's engaged as one of the 4 principal investigators of a large-scale and internationally collaborative public history project on the Chinese workers who built the Central Pacific Railroad, which is, of course, you know, co-owned by Leland Stanford, founder of the university that bears his name. Hu-DeHart has co-edited a forthcoming book with NYU Press on Latino politics, and she's recently published in the journal Modern Asian Studies an article entitled Chinatowns and Borderlands, Inter-Asian Encounters in the Diaspora. So as you see, we have 4 scholars who bring a range of expertise, and this is going to be a really tremendous opportunity for us to think about what labor and focusing on working people will do for our understanding of the history of sugar. So without further ado, I turn the podium over to our first presenter, Lydia Pulsipher. Thank you.
Somebody has walked off with my sheets. Okay, it's been such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, everybody, for your wonderful papers. Throughout the sessions, I have constantly found ways in which you were connecting with what I think about and maybe even will talk about today. But they're now far too numerous to mention, so let's see if you see any connections. I'm going to make a very minor resistance against the concept of resistance as it is part of our focus here. I think it does not adequately cover the ingenuity and entrepreneurial activities of slaves. It doesn't capture their connection to nature and place, and their search for humanity and community. And hopefully, as I talk, you'll see why I'm thinking this way. My story takes place today between 1660 and the present. It's about a plantation and the laborers on that plantation and their descendants. The plantation is Galway's estate on the island of Montserrat, in the Soufriere hills of that island. How they, within the confines of servitude and slavery on this estate, sized up the resources available to them and made a life for themselves. How they created an enduring community that survives even though Galway's mountain was obliterated by nature in 1997. A volcano completely blew out that part of the island. Beyond Sugar being the original name of this conference, for me is meaning beyond the space of the sugar estate, in the mountains and ravines, in the rivers, in the ocean even, offshore of Montserrat, and also beyond in the sense of time, that is, what has happened since sugar. Montserrat was a sugar island for hundreds of years, and the relics of sugar are everywhere. They're now tourist attractions in large part. Montserrat is still a British possession. The people of Montserrat, though they are now doctors and lawyers and teachers and taxi drivers and bureaucrats and so forth, still have to deal with the globalizing economy through Great Britain. The paper is based on research from 1973 to 2013. I just came back from Montserrat a few weeks ago. Most of that research was at Galway's estate, but in 1995 a volcano began to erupt, and I was not back at Galway since 1995. By 1997, the whole side of that island was destroyed. What you see here are 3 representations of Galway's. Right here is the building as I knew it, built about after 1765. This is my representation of the estate after we had done a good bit of archaeology there. And this down here is artist's representation of Galway's, based on the archaeology, based on her friendship with us and many years of discussions about what was going on there. I think that's a particularly attractive version, certainly beats mine. The laborers at Galway's, starting in 1660, were Irish indentured servants, about 300 plus of them. And then by 1680, the labor force was ever more dominated by Africans who had been enslaved. Now, Montserrat is in the Eastern Caribbean. I'm sure you all know where it is. But just a word about these two maps. Because of the volcanic nature of Montserrat and how it has affected this research, I want to point out that these islands are on the edge of the Caribbean plate. The Atlantic plate is subducting under the Caribbean plate, and that confrontation between the two plates produces numerous volcanoes. These are all rather ancient, but they are still potentially active, as we learn to our chagrin. This is Montserrat, old mountains in the north, somewhat newer mountains in the center, and the Soufriere Hills in the south, which are now active volcanoes. This is a map of Montserrat from 1673, and it's held by the John Carter Brown Library. I used it extensively in my dissertation many years ago, and it is a lovely coastal profile map of the island, probably done by William Stapleton, then the governor of the island, who circumvented the island in a boat, probably on several occasions, and he drew what he saw from every position that he decided to take. His boat probably drifted in and out, so he got different projections on his various drawings, but he linked them together in a creative way that leads you to think that he missed the inside of the island, but he didn't. This mountain is this mountain. These two mountains are those two mountains. These mountains up here are the backsides of these. So the whole center is there. And I can attest to that because I transferred all this data onto a topographic map more similar to this, and that was quite a job before computers. And then I measured the clearings, and I came with a few hundred acres of what was reported to the Office of Trades and Plantations as being that amount of land cleared at that point in time. So I'm pretty confident that I did it okay. But the cultural detail on that map is really amazing. I encourage you to have a look at it sometime if you have the opportunity. Now, this is Galway's Mountain, where Galway's plantation was situated. We're high above the ocean here at almost 3,000 feet. This is the same mountain, a somewhat more close-up perspective. You can see the steep terrain here. Galway's is located further down at about 1,100 feet, so halfway down the mountain. If you look up here, you can see some clearings of gardens, and just kind of keep that situation in mind because I'm going to talk about gardens in a moment. This is a diagram of the ecological zones of a typical tropical mountain, and Galway's mountain only goes up about this high. Sugar is grown up to about 1,500 feet or so typically, and that is exactly where it was grown on Montserrat. This is a part of that 1673 map that depicts Galway's mountain. This is where Galway's estate was roughly, it's not shown on this map, in the 17th century, and it was moved up to 1,100 feet in the 18th century. These houses and plots shown here by the governor are probably the homes of Irish indentured servants and their pigs and chickens, because they're little structures almost with every house. I don't think that's an exact representation of what the situation was, but it's his effort to show it in any case. What I say today is based on ethnography, archaeology, archival work, and field geography. I'm a geographer, and I am particularly interested in human ecology, or the way in which people intimately interact with the environment in which they find themselves. We did ethnographic analysis of archival texts. Much of that was done here at Brown, but other visuals as well. We did 20 years of participant observation in the Galway's community. That means we spent a lot of time with that community. My husband and I, he's the archaeologist, I'm the geographer. And that time spent proved to be highly valuable. We also did formal ethnography with the descendants of Galway's laborers. We did archaeology on Galway's mountain and Galway's estate. And we mapped and did ethnography in house yards, the meaning of which I hope will become clear in a moment. Now, all that ethnography can't be recounted here, but I thought I'd give you one example. And that would be Nellie Dyer. She had a major role to play in helping us understand slavery days. How could that be? She was born in 1912, and at age 2 was left with her great-grandmother, Rosetta Williams, who had been born in 1823. Rosetta died in 1935 at age 112, so Nellie spent quite a bit of time with her as she was in her upper ages, and apparently this was a woman who kept her faculties until the very end. Slavery was ended in 1834, so Rosetta lived 11 years as a slave, but then the conditions of slavery persisted into the 20th century, and we heard that many times from our informants there. From Rosetta, Nellie learned countless practical skills from gardening, plant and meat processing, cooking, baking, vending, running a bar, and general getting along, which Nellie was very good at. Much of this she passed on to us. Now, what you see here at the bottom, this is Nellie showing us how to use a grinding stone to grind salt for processing goat meat, but she used that same grinding stone to help us to show us how to process cacao beans and other things as well. We found a lot of grinding stones eventually in the slave village. This is Nellie walking up Galway's mountain right after Hurricane Hugo had completely stripped the forest of its leaves. And this is Nellie shortly before her death, standing in front of the old people's home. Elegant as it was, she hated it there. And I'm sorry she had to die there, but she did. A short review follows now of the selected resource management enterprises of those who labored at Galway's. We found evidence for these in the archaeological and archival records, and we also found them still to be alive in the 20th century at Galway's. They're still alive in the 21st century. Okay, I'm going to talk especially about gardening because it played such an important role. Most of you are very well aware of that, and of course Douglas Hall and Sidney Mintz made that clear way back in the 1960s, I think it was. But I hadn't really appreciated the detailed understanding of environments that was the case with cultivators in the tropical Caribbean. And so my study with some of these people that you see in front of you here really helped me get a much better understanding of just what scientists they were, in fact. This again is Galway's Mountain, which you can see over here. This is a cultivation plot, and that's a typical grade or slant for a cultivation plot. They had techniques for using steep slopes. They still have them. And I can't take the time to go into the details there. But this is Joe Belshoy, who was an important informant to our project. He had about 10 acres up from this place here, further up. He grew 40 different species of plants, and he knew each one intimately. He was a horticulturalist, not a cultivator, because he treated each plant and its requirements separately. He understood that you could plant some things next to others and they would help each other, or they might trouble each other, and so you shouldn't plant them together, and so forth. He went on and on. He had to carefully manage the environment. Sometimes he had too much water, sometimes he didn't have enough, and he had to harvest everything and transport it down this steep slope. He could sell some of his produce in his own village, but most of it he had to take to town on his donkey. That donkey is carrying hay, not groceries, but that is the way in which he took it into town to the capital of Plymouth to sell. Now, I promised to cover the processing of cassava for Julie Kim. It figures heavily in the diet of Caribbean people, but not as a sole food product, please. They had to eat many other things in order to get a decent diet if cassava was part of it. Cassava is pretty much empty calories, but it's got an interesting role to play in the cuisine of the Eastern Caribbean. You have to harvest the cassava. It's a root crop. You have to peel it, wash it and peel it, and then you grate it in this flywheel contraption here. You can see a close-up of it there. And by the way, we found artifacts of cassava production in the slave village, so we know that it was practiced there. Then after you have the grated cassava, you pack that into a bag. No, sorry, you soak it overnight. Then you pack it into a gunny sack or some container and put it in a press. You see the gunny sack right there? The press is a classic fulcrum press. And when our colleagues in the archaeology project at Galway's found the hole drilled in the boulder where that thing has to fit, okay, wow, I gotta really speed up here. They knew immediately what it was and set up a mock system for us. This is the real thing. Then after you squeeze the water out, you have to dry it, and then ultimately you can bake it on a griddle. In fact, that's pretty much what people do. Not too many other things are done with cassava. But it will store in your rafters for 6 months, and the bugs won't eat it, and the mice won't eat it, and maybe you shouldn't eat it, I'm not sure. I'd like to talk about the role of children. This is a kid making rope out of Sansevieria fiber, but I don't have time. This is boat making, which we found evidence of in the Galway's village. This is freshwater fishing, shell fishing. Again, we found evidence of that. And as our research progressed, we could see that the most important achievement of Galway's people was community building, an accomplishment that remains into the 21st century. We could see that the key to Galway's and other Montserrat communities was the house yard way of life. It slowly registered that house yards had their social and material origins in plantation villages, and so our study of house yards helped us to develop a model for the excavation of the village at Galway's. And what you could see here, if you're not behind my computer, is a village in Antigua and another one in St. Kitts, and a close-up of an old lady taking care of a baby right here. Those formed the basis for my design of this house yard study, which turned out to be enormously useful in figuring out what kind of a footprint a slave village would be likely to leave in the land, and therefore what we should look for as we were digging. House yards are multiple situations with multiple houses. Most of them are lived in by family members, but that is not necessary. They can be renters and so forth. Animal pens, water catching and storage devices, ovens, food preparation, kitchen gardens. There's the sharing of resources and care, elder care and baby care. Gender relations turned out to be very interesting, and family organization as well. And I wish I could tell you about the role of uncles, because it's truly fascinating, but again, no time. Please notice this map here. We made 13 of them from 13 different house yards, mapping waste disposal, where you washed your dishes, where you threw your garbage, where you kept your pig and your chicken, where you baked and cooked and so forth. And it's those maps then that became the model for the archaeology. And this is us digging in the Galway's village. There turned out to be about 15 houses and evidence of all kinds of activity, including cassava processing, as I mentioned. These are some of the artifacts that came from that effort. These artifacts all above that line are from the slave village, and notice that these are notably different from those which came from the Great House. We think these were purchased by slaves and that the money for doing that came from their various entrepreneurial activities, including gardening and cassava processing and so forth. When we were in the midst of that archaeology, this is what happened. And that pretty much put a stop to it. So we are stuck now with 20,000 artifacts to process and so forth. This is the mountain as you saw it at the beginning of my talk. This is the mountain today. Pretty breathtaking. That stretch right there is this stretch right here. Montserrat can now be lived in only to the south of that line. You can see that's pretty much where everybody used to live. Now they all live in the north. And I have one more picture for you. The Galways community was diffused to England, North America, and Antigua, but the few who stayed behind were reconstituted at Lookout in the north of Montserrat. And one has to admit are cute houses. Nothing wrong with them. By the way, they were donated by Cuba, but they don't really allow life as it was lived on Galway's mountain. No donkeys, no pigs, no chickens, and no ovens, and so forth. Okay, I'm finished.
Like the many before me, I'd like to take just one quick moment to thank so much the conveners of this conference. I have learned an enormous amount already. I have made many new friends, and I look forward to many conversations in the coming weeks and years. Sugar ensnared millions of Africans in the talons of Anglo-European greed. This is a paper about the grim side of this story. I feel compelled to tell you beforehand that it includes historical narratives of rape, torture, and execution. And if your sensibilities do not allow for such subjects, this is a great opportunity for a coffee break. A bumpy 20-minute drive south from the coastal highway leads to Good Hope, an 18th-century Jamaican plantation. Passing the steep drive up to the Great House, the road leads between a stone warehouse and a diminutive lodge down towards the rushing waters of the Martha Brae River. Just before the river on the flat parcel to the right stands a substantial cut stone building that now serves as an orange packing plant. This was Good Hope's boiling house, where raw cane juice was purified, separating molasses and other residue from the thick cane syrup that would cure into crystallized sugar. When in production, the boiling house was the center of any plantation's sugar works, and the sugar works were the center of the sugar plantation. This brief paper argues that the boiling house on any Jamaican sugar plantation was at the heart of an extraordinary landscape, simultaneously industrial, global, and violent. Unlike tobacco or rice, the refinement of sugar was an incredibly complicated process that required careful synchronization of labor and product. One late 18th century planter described the sugar plantation as a well-constructed machine, compounded of various wheels turning in different ways, yet all contributing to the great end proposed. Enslaved laborers planted acres and acres of cane shoots in straight rows. Once cut, the sugar juice in the cane would begin to ferment within hours. So the recently cut cane had to be quickly crushed in a mill, extracting the juice to be carried on to the boiling house for reduction through a series of coppers into molasses and purified cane. The press to refine the sugar before it's spoiled, together with the financial investment of starting up the boiling house, and the constant drive towards greater profits, meant that the boiling houses often ran 24 hours a day for days or weeks at a time. The juice was then cured in the huge curing house, usually for weeks, before being packaged into hogsheads for exportation. The molasses byproduct was either used as a calorie supplement for the enslaved, or could be distilled into rum, usually in another large building called a distillery. A sugar works was a substantial capital investment, and as a result, in the 18th century British Caribbean, there was no such thing as a small sugar planter. One of the major investments could be in an efficient water mill, the construction of which often required weirs and floodgates, canals, dams, and aqueducts, simply to get the water to the mill. In 1770, one Jamaican planter petitioned and won from the Colonial Assembly the right to bring water to the mill on his plantation via an extensive aqueduct and a half-mile brick-lined tunnel through an adjacent mountain range. The investment of a sugar works was not just in buildings, but also in machinery. One 17th century writer warned that planters would want to regularly inspect the rollers, gauges, sockets, sweeps, cogs, or bray trees, because if any of these failed, the works would stand still. The same would be true for the equipment in the boiling house, where the brick platforms that carried the coppers might crack or break because of the violence of the heat from the furnaces. Again, such a mishap would mean a stop in the work till that be mended. In each case, the single failure brings the entire process to a halt, for, as one author says, all of these depend on one another as wheels in a clock. And bringing the process to a halt meant a significant loss, as all the cut cane would be spoilt before the machinery could be repaired. The sugar plantation was obviously agricultural, but it was also industrial. The time and labor discipline central to the successful operation of a sugar plantation is one of the central features of industrialization. Furthermore, the complexity of the process required the organization of the labor force into interchangeable units. As Sidney Mintz and others have argued, Jamaica's sugar plantations were among the earliest and most economically important dimensions of Britain's nascent industrial revolution. The sugar works, of course, depended entirely on the labor of those slaves who lived in the plantation village. And I assume this has a little, yeah. And so this is the map I've just shown you. This is the complex of the sugar works. Here is the enslaved village, labeled Negro houses. I'll be talking about that. This is also an early 19th century painting of exactly the same plantation. And just off here, behind this tree, is this group of houses. It depended entirely on the labor of those slaves that lived in the plantation village, a collection of houses used to shelter the enslaved inhabitants. The village at Good Hope, seen here, appears to have been comprised of about 50 individual buildings, each positioned on its own small lot. The houses built for and by Africans in 18th century Jamaica were usually 2 rooms, each only 10 feet by 8 in dimension. The houses were usually mud-walled and thatch-roofed, in forms not unlike examples still found along the West African coast. This is an example of an Igbo house in coastal Ghana that I photographed just a year ago. Most accounts of the report that the houses are composed of hard posts driven into the ground. The whole of the house frame is lashed secure with vines, which the woods afford of great size and great abundance. The interior and exterior of each wall was plastered smooth with mud. The roofs are almost always comprised of thatch of the palm tree or coconut tree, descending down either side of a horizontal ridgepole, with some bending to one side to the opposite of the roof. As we've just heard, critical to the house site is the yard garden, providing some provisions for the consumption of those in the house, but also a means of generating revenue, both around the house as well as the provision grounds, as we heard in an earlier talk. As one writer argued, with their surplus produce, the pigs and poultry, they supply even to the distance of Anado Bay, which is some distance in this instance, and from this traffic they derive a very considerable profit. Africans commonly grew yams, cassava, corn, plantains, bananas, pepper trees, mangoes, oranges, and other fruit, as well as building pens for hogs and poultry. Interspersed with trees, slave villages were often described as picturesque by late 18th century British observers, a complicated term as we know. And here I'm cheating, this is a South Carolina painting, but it makes my point. Comprised of clusters of houses, each positioned on their own parcel and supported by an aggregate of smaller sheds and pens, the village was the site of a wide range of everyday activities. One of the activities that animated life in the village that received the most commentary by white observers, of course, was music and dancing. As numerous scholars have made clear, music and dance played a critical role in West African life, and this persisted to Jamaica's shores. While most observers derided the dancing as grotesque, a few recognized its complexity. Wrote Matthew Lewis, "I am told there is a regular figure, and that the least mistake or single false step is immediately noticed by all the rest." Dancing was almost always supported by drumming. Because white planters knew that the function of a drum as a vehicle for communication, drumming was legally outlawed in Jamaica, although it was used all the time. The village was also, of course, the site of occasional events of great importance, specifically births and deaths within the community. Some accounts suggest that the birth of a child was attended with the burial of the placenta near the door of the house. Often a small tree was planted over the site, establishing a connection between child, tree, and house. But the house site was also incredibly important at time of death. Deceased enslaved Africans were occasionally buried in the immediate vicinity of their house and gardens, sometimes even under their bed. The early Jamaican sugar plantation was an extraordinarily profitable machine whose efficiency depended wholly on a compliant workforce. Jamaican planters knew that there was much at stake, for as all planters recognized, the labor of slaves is, in the words of one planter, the foundation of our riches. But if that workforce was central to the health of the planters, and even the nation at large, it was also a potential tinderbox. Tacky's rebellion in 1760 was only the most extraordinary and horrific of a series of slave insurrections on the island throughout the 18th and the 19th centuries, reinforcing the baldly honest sentiment of one planter, however they may disguise it, slaves hate their masters and wish them all destroyed. As a result, British planters enlisted the plantation as a landscape of control, exercising authority over the enslaved majority through fear, which Brian Edwards suggested is the leading principle upon which our government is supported. From their first encounter with Africans well through emancipation, white Jamaicans used corporal torture as a means of punishing those who resisted their slavery. One writer noted that if any slaves commit robbery, prove sullen, or refuse to work, they were bound hand and foot to the whipping post, which they have in all plantations. The whipping was followed by a salt rub, which proves so painful it forces them to their work again. If their infraction, however, was serious, planters and overseers substituted molasses for the salt and left the slave to stand for some time for the wasps, merrywigs, and other insects to torment. Overseer Thomas Thistlewood also used human feces, which he rubbed on the faces of disciplined slaves. On occasion, he required one slave to urinate into the face and mouth of another. His most extreme version of these practices, however, was called Derby's dose, when the flogging and the salt rub was followed by the order of one slave to defecate into the open mouth of the victim. The African was then immediately put in a gag whilst his mouth is full, and the gag left in place for hours. As recent historians have demonstrated, white planters and overseers in 18th century Jamaica knew no real limits to the punishments they might exact. The Jamaican plantation was also a landscape of death. Many towns had places of public execution, and on occasion such executions extended also to the landscapes of plantations. In May of 1764, one diarist noted in passing, "A Negro wench was hanged at Saval-la-Mar today." A few years later, he noted that Stomp was burned alive this evening. His wife, Dr. Fraser's Polly, a mulatto, was hanged. And in these 18th century accounts, it's astonishing the extent to which there's clear familiarity between the author and the killed victim. They know them by name. These public executions had an afterlife that marked the plantation landscape. In 1774, Thomas Thistlewood noted, "The head of Gold, the rebel, carried to leeward this evening to be put up as a terror," and terror is being used here as a noun, as an object. A reminder to slaves of the consequences of rebellion. In the early 19th century, another sugar planter openly acknowledged our necessity of terror to coerce obedience. Such terrors were not uncommon. They were to be found along roadways and on plantations. On one occasion, Lady Nugent, governor's wife, reported that had she not already promised her attendance at church, she would not have gone, for we were obliged to pass close by the pole on which was stuck the head of a black man who was executed a few days ago. In another example, the head of one planter's slaves, a thief and a persistent runaway, was put on a pole and stuck out in the home pasture. White male power over enslaved Africans was exacted in particular ways on enslaved women. And actually, before I move on to that, this is a sketch of a Jamaican town. This is a gibbet, which is a post with two iron cages. This is a 1760s drawing from Jamaica. One cage has the body of an enslaved African in it. The other does not. These are cages in which the body would be put perfectly alive and then would just be left to expire from dehydration, attack by vultures, etc. White male power over enslaved Africans was exacted in particular ways on enslaved women. As Trevor Bernard has demonstrated, planters and overseers enlisted forcible sex upon their female enslaved Africans as a mechanism of social control. One overseer's diary records sexual activity, in this one instance, with 138 women in his 37 years on Jamaica, averaging 14 different women a year. This man raped women as punishment for transgressions. The reality of consistent rape meant that for enslaved women, the plantation was a particular landscape of fear. Women fell victim to our diarist in the curing house, in the wash house, in cane fields, on the loading dock, on the on the hill overlooking the sea, on the garden bench, in their provision grounds, in her house. In a 1751 account, he reports having sex with Flora among the canes. He raped Ellen in the garden, where just the day before she had been weeding. He even raped women in the houses of other slaves. In response, enslaved women surely navigated the plantation in a way that attended to this fear. Furthermore, those who undertook to leave their own plantation without permission risked likely rape if they were caught traveling illegally and alone. These realities of life on Jamaican plantations marked those landscapes with sights of terror that simply do not appear on plantation plats. Whipping posts were common and well-used sites of discipline. Numerous slaves, especially runaways and those caught otherwise avoiding labor, were punished first with whippings and then extended agony through the application of various juices, oils, and syrups. The public display of these beatings mirrored public executions taking place in Jamaica's towns. Executions were usually followed by the public display of the victim's head, posted on roadways on plantations as objects of terror. And for enslaved women, the plantation landscape was a landscape of rape, where white planters and overseers unleashed their desire and punishment on women in fields, garden benches, curing houses, and their own home. Over the course of the 18th century, savvy planters added a second mechanism to suppress slave resistance and to support the smooth operation of their plantation. This mechanism is surveillance. One of the most critical features of an overseer's house was its position in the landscape. William Beckford directed that the overseer's house was to be situated on an eminence overlooking the works. Thomas Ruffley argued that the overseer's house should be placed so that all the works can be seen from it. Overseers' houses were often outfitted with piazzas. You can see two examples here. This is actually the Beckford house site, which is over in the JCB. Positioned in the highest spot in the vicinity of the works, the overseer's house has a tall roof that sweeps to incorporate piazzas that appear on at least two, if not three, of the four sides. The literal oversight and management of the plantation from the piazza was increasingly assisted through the use of spyglasses and telescopes. In 1754, for example, Thistlewood had two of his slaves flogged for meddling with my watch and telescope, both of which are kept on his piazza. Telescopes, also called spyglasses, were ever present on piazzas by the 1790s. If the telescope allowed the overseer supernatural view into the working of the plantation, the presence of the watch allowed the imposition of time discipline over a process that depended heavily on careful timing. These changes reveal a minor practice among some planters on Jamaica in the very late 18th and early 19th centuries. While the vast majority of Africans were free to locate their houses where they willed, and we see that in that earlier plat, right? These are what appears to be sort of just a jumble of houses randomly positioned by their builders. A few enslaved Africans found themselves on plantations with barracks or linearly aligned streets or rows of houses, and you can see that here, a quite different arrangement. In 1790, William Beckford noted the increasing tendency to build quarters in streets. It is now the custom to have quarters built in straight lines, he wrote, constructed with some degree of uniformity and strength, but totally divested of trees and shrubs. The absence of trees and shrubs, so important to the slave yard gardens, allowed what? Unobstructed sightlines. Some documentary evidence suggests that slaves resisted their location from open villages into these aligned streets. John Bailey would write that although he built a slave village of houses uniform in size and shape, at first his slaves refused to occupy them, stating that they were so much exposed to their neighbors that they did not like them knowing what they were doing on all occasions. Eventually, however, the Africans got a fashion among them and would not make fires in their several houses. They spoilt my range by putting up kitchens or outbuildings in front of their houses for themselves. While planters might have directed the construction of streets or roads on sites devoid of large vegetation, allowing greater surveillance over those spaces, enslaved Africans fought back by building sheds that restored privacy. If British planters exacted terror to reinforce their authority over Africans, they also eventually imposed surveillance over the landscape, but although often with limited success. Comprised of factories and African houses, but also marked with sites of terror and memories of rape, the Jamaican plantation was an extraordinary landscape, simultaneously industrial, global, contested. And in this way, it is one of Britain's most modern landscapes. Thank you.
I too would like to thank the organizers and the JCB and all of you for a great conference. I also want to thank you all because this has given me an opportunity to return to a topic that I actually studied many years ago and to critique myself as I extend my analysis with a bit more mature vision than at that time. The highlight of La Esperanza Plantation in northern Puerto Rico is a West Point foundry, steam engine, and sugar mill built in 1861, painstakingly restored to working condition. On special occasions, the Conservation Trust, which owns the property, fires up the old machines to the amazement of onlookers. La Esperanza's sugar works are, after all, one of the last functioning steam mills of their kind in the world. And it has taken the Trust decades of investment in ingenious retrofitting and historical research to get it to this point. Dozens of engineers, historians, and anthropologists have reconstructed the buildings and machines and traced the story of the Fernandez family, owners of the hacienda at the time of the upgrade to steam. This labor of love has also focused on the lives of 170 slaves or so, who made the modern estate a profitable venture during the final years of slavery, just before the institution was outlawed by Spanish decree in 1873. La Esperanza's origins and 19th century history mirror those of a couple of hundred estates that once dotted the coastal landscape. The plantation dates from the early 19th century when the island turned decisively towards sugar production and export, caused by Haiti's virtual ruin. As in Cuba, sugar's resurgence in Puerto Rico also hinged on a Spanish colonial policy that favored slave-based export agriculture in its final 2 American colonies, even as Caribbean slave-based producers of all imperial stripes started feeling the heat from transatlantic abolitionism and slave resistance. Cuba, of course, was the main actor in this drama as it underwent its own sugar revolution beginning around 1838. It pivoted from a society with slaves to a slave society, one in which slavery affected everything about the society: labor, social relations, property, habits, values, even science, literature, philosophy. Unlike Cuba, Puerto Rico never became a slave plantation society. Only 12% of its population at its peak around 1845 were enslaved. Yet its sugar production and exports rose significantly throughout the century, and already by the mid-1800s, it was the region's second largest producer and exporter. At least until 1840, a portion of the coffee exported from the island was also produced on estates worked by slaves. 140 years after emancipation, however, the memory of La Esperanza's slaves is all but lost to the communities that surround the 2,200-acre estate. Not long ago, historian Humberto Garcia Muñiz searched in vain in these communities for anyone who had any historical or cultural memory of the slaves on the neighboring estate. Worse, he says, what was true of La Esperanza seemed to describe a more widespread erasure. Quote, "I went looking for a black community between Arecibo and Bayamon, driving all over, asking around, and I didn't find one." He wrote to me in an email, quote, "I asked Marcelino Canino, who knew the region better, and he said there wasn't one. He need not say it, for I knew what he implied. Unlike communities in Loíza, Guayama, and Ponce, among others, which occupy a prominent place in Puerto Ricans' imaginaries of where blackness is inscribed, performed, and reproduced, longtime residents of an area where once thousands of slaves toiled seem to have obliterated their presence from collective memory." The question of why Puerto Ricanos of the northern plains have forgotten the slaves of La Esperanza is not what will occupy me here. I bring it up because it suggests other questions about the relationship between the slave minority and the majority in a society dominated by free peasants of long standing. These so-called jíbaros had some connection to a remote slave past, but one that was arguably tenuous and distant, especially for the dwellers of the hilly interior. Since the 16th century, fugitive Africans and Taínos had intermingled with former soldiers and stowaways from the imperial fleets to forge the human amalgam that settled in Puerto Rico's interior and in many ways came to define who the islanders were. The questions I seek to address are specific to the renaissance of plantation slavery in the 19th century and the transition to the politics of remembering and forgetting. More pointedly, how did the so-called second slavery in the Spanish Caribbean affect interactions between jíbaro peasants, ambiguously regarded as whites by themselves and others, and the people forcibly introduced from Africa by the tens of thousands after 1815? And what is it to be learned from it all? As these are questions that scholars have not fully addressed, my approach is historiographical and conceptual, not empirical. Research on the 19th century sugar and slavery complex, while not expressly dealing with slave-peasant relations, on the immediate allows some tentative answers. Further, scholars have lifted the veil on the immediate post-emancipation period, a time, we know now, when formerly enslaved workers made myriad choices on where to live, with whom, both communally and domestically, and what occupations and lifestyles to pursue. In the rest of this talk, I will try to tease insights from this research. The writings of Colonel George W. Flinter, an Irish, quote, soldier of fortune, intermittently at the service of the Spanish monarchy and author in the 1830s of two influential books on Puerto Rico, will serve as a starting point. Much of what we thought we knew about the island's second slavery originated in the propaganda efforts on the Spanish government's behalf that he carried out. Flinter, it turns out, played fast and loose with the realities of enslavement, no doubt to steer abolitionists' eyes away from Puerto Rico's less than benign turn toward plantation and slavery. In an account on the present state on the island of Puerto Rico in 1834, his both thorough work, Flinter argued repeatedly that the agricultural wealth of sugar, coffee, minor crops, and some tobacco was produced by a mix of enslaved and free workers with a preponderance for the latter. Census data that he brought on demonstrated that the enslaved groups had been growing, sorry about that, had been growing at a faster rate than free people for several decades. Yet Flinter, focused on absolute numbers rather than rates, insisted that there was a clear tendency toward greater use of unbound labor, especially in coffee, tobacco, and among the peasant sector. His reasoning was mathematically accurate, but confusing on purpose. The free population was so much greater than the slaves, 9-to-1, that as time passed, more and more of Puerto Rico's agricultural output was indeed generated by non-slaves. But this was not true of the all-important sugar output. which was overwhelmingly dependent on the labor of enslaved Africans, most of them recently imported. Notice here that by the middle years of the 19th century, Puerto Rico attains its highest enslaved population total of 51,000. Flinter used arguments like this to argue forcefully that slavery, a dying institution in his view, could not compete in efficiency and profitability with uncoerced labor. It was more of a hypothetical argument and an aspiration than a reflection of island conditions, where, as Sidney Mintz has argued, and argued many years ago, the renaissance of sugar had curtailed everybody's freedom, both for the enslaved and the long-time free. There was movement in the general direction of free labor, I admit, but it would not really show up in the larger and more efficient sugar estates until after 1860. Before that date, larger and better capitalized plantations throughout the island employed slaves almost exclusively in both harvesting and processing. These estates together were responsible for a very large percentage of the island's exportable sugar. Reminding his Spanish superiors in 1876, the year apprentices' obligations to work under contract lapsed, Governor Segundo de la Portilla called slave labor, quote, the medullary nerve of production, unquote, and recalled planters' efforts to hire free workers only for specific tasks. Geographical and social distance between the free peasant majority and the plantations was the key. Quote, he said, the Jibaro laborer who lives on the mountain, where he occupies himself in the cultivation of minor crops, taking care at the same time of tobacco and coffee, comes down to the plains only during sugarcane harvest time, and even then the number who come down is small, because those who live in the interior of the island leave their communities with reluctance. This is 1876. Sentiments like these were frequently heard from planters and government officials. In Puerto Rico throughout the 19th century, there was a great deal of labor power, but little actual labor to accomplish the onerous and highly racialized tasks of harvesting cane and producing sugar, an indicator of the remaining, albeit diminishing, strength of Jibaro society. On the question of free labor and its presence on plantations, size matter a great deal. Second and third tier estates, often located in areas removed from the coast on hilly terrain with marginal soils, were different from the first tier plantations upon whom the colony's wealth depended. By the 1840s, if not earlier, owners and managers of these smaller farms had begun assigning to estate slaves those mill tasks that required more skill, practice, and sheer resistance to heat and toil. Meantime, late laborers, called jornaleros, organized into gangs of cane cutters and haulers, performed many of the agricultural jobs that required less skill. Yet these middling and smaller planters in the second and third tiers, a group that accounted for less than a third of sugar exports, complained loudly and constantly about the unreliability of their peones. Free laborers were not to be trusted, did not form a solid foundation upon which to build profitable enterprises. Yet at the same time, estates like these could hardly afford more slaves than the few they had. By the 1860s, when Puerto Rico's sugar industry ran into rough times, many of these plantations failed, typically folded into more robust neighboring estates. Note that reliance on slave labor and its reverse, appropriation of peasant labor, were not only differentiated by estate size, but also across island space. Geographic, ecological, demographic, and historical features together created this difference. In the fertile but dry southern plain, from Ponce to Patillas, right there, there's a big alluvial plain, a highly fertile plain. In the fan-shaped valley of Mayagüez in the west, and in a handful of other districts, plantations newly founded after 1815, often by immigrants from the neighboring islands, were more intensively cultivated. They were more similar to those of the British, Danish, and French West Indies in their management model, technologically quite advanced, and for all these reasons, almost exclusively operated with slaves. The three most important sugar-producing districts of Mayagüez, Ponce, and Guayama were located here, and as the slave trade developed into a major supplier of labor for island exporters between 1815 and 50, they stood out as communities where, as early as 1824, enslaved people made up more than 20% of the population, and by the way, that would jump even further high, near 30% later on. As time passed and new municipalities along the Ponce Patillas plain developed into bigger players in the export economy, the pattern emerged there too. These were the areas of Puerto Rico where it would prove hardest to incorporate day laborers into the supplementary workforce during the harvest, and where by implication interactions between free peasants and the enslaved were less common, more remote, and less intimate. Geography and climate played a role in this, as I've said. In the Ponce Patillas plain, for instance, the dry, often denuded foothills just to the north of the valley of the Cordillera Central were not areas conducive to peasant settlement. From Salinas to the uphill valley of Ay Bonito, for example, there are more than 30 kilometers, and in between terrain that is mostly inhospitable to peasant settlement. Mintz and others have shown that in the early to mid-20th century, it was common for highlanders to migrate seasonally to the cane plantations of the coast during the harvest. But this was surely a migration that most people of the 19th century would have avoided, since estates did not yet provide housing and plots for free workers. The only resident workers there were the enslaved, often living in barracones, in barracoons. Planters deliberately kept these two groups apart in order not to discourage the free laborer cane cutters that some of them felt they had to hire during the harvest. Only an exceptional jíbaro who would room in the barracks of enslaved blacks, against whom many a Highlander was deeply prejudiced. Mintz's mid-20th century research in Santa Isabel revealed that for migrant Highlanders, the darker people of the coast were still diablitos, or little devils. In the northern plain, from Arecibo to Fajardo, a region densely settled by plantations and peasants for centuries, the situation was starkly different. During the course of the 19th century, large plantations like La Esperanza mixed in with a much larger number of smaller farms to create an assemblage of units of varying scale and importance. Some were organized very much like those on the southern plain, and their owners or managers resisted employing supplementary day laborers. Even La Esperanza might have been like this, but others surely did not. The difference may have been decisive in the way that enslaved people and the free peasants interacted there. For one, the average estate was smaller and possessed many fewer slaves. I have some data here that I will skip over in the interest of time. But I will say this, that the fact that the sugar industry developed in contrasting ecological and demographic settings is important for the problems identified in this presentation. The most capacious, but more socially isolated, sugar estates were primarily in the south and west, where peasant settlement historically had been thin and where the zones of peasant migration, once the sugar boom started, were less accessible. In the north, by contrast, plantations of different sizes and varying degrees of dependence on slave labor mixed in with a much denser stratum of peasants whose ancestors had lived in the zone for many generations. Many of them descended from people of diverse origins and were regarded in colonial racial terms as pardos, lighter skinned but of dubious ancestral origins, and mulattos or negros libres. The relative abundance in the northern coastal area of peasant communities with a high percentage of Afro-descended people provides an interesting lead, then, into our central question. Peasants and slaves were physically more proximate there. A more diverse mix of employers with different views on getting enslaved and free workers together in the same enterprise characterized the region. And because peasant involvement in sugar had begun there earlier and proceeded further apace than in the modern haciendas south and west, it is therefore likely that more frequent and intimate, no doubt also familial, social interactions between them had taken place there in the 19th century. Thank you very much.
Okay, wait a minute. Great. And I have some handouts, something you can all take back with you if you're interested. There are extra copies here and there are extra copies on that table if you did not get one when I distributed it earlier. It consists of 3 pages, double side, 1 table, and 5 images. Sugar and slaves are always linked together in the history of the Americas, especially the Caribbean. African slaves, of course, being the primary source of plantation labor for hundreds of years. For a brief period, 25 years in the mid-19th century, another form of coerced labor was also linked to Caribbean sugar, this in the form of indentured immigrant labor involving South Asians or East Indians and Chinese, almost all men. The word coolie has been used to designate these workers. Now, the word coolie is actually of Urdu origin, although some people think it's Chinese because it sounds like the word for bitter labor in Mandarin, coolie, but it is not a Chinese word. Nevertheless, it has been most often linked to the Chinese and designates an abject worker, agricultural worker at the bottom of the heap. And it is also linked to migrant labor in the age of globalization, when demand for cheap labor rose all around the world and in all of the modern world's imperial systems. So coolies have been found throughout Southeast Asia and throughout the Americas. The British first experimented with it and then focused on bringing East Indian indentured labor to their British West Indies colonies, then left the field wide open for the Spaniards and the Cubans to move in to recruit labor from the South China coast. The Spaniards, of course, in Cuba, the Peruvians who had been recently gained their independence. The Peruvians managed their own importation of Chinese contract labor. I'm not going to go into the Peruvian case, but in both of these cases, and in the East Indian case in the British West Indies, all of these indentured labor, contract labor, came with contracts. What is different about the Spanish and the Peruvian case, though, is that their contracts were bilingual. They all had a Spanish version and a Chinese version, and you have copies of that in your handouts. And what is really unique about the Cuba case, which is what I'm going to talk about today, is that these Chinese contract laborers called coolies worked alongside African slaves, and that really makes it a truly unique situation. So we're going to look at the coolies of Cuba. It was called La Trata Amarilla, the yellow trade, and to shore up the dwindling African slave labor force. In the table that you have, which here, before we go on, here are some, this is an American sketch, and it's an enraged coolie. You can see he brought his Chinese, what do we call those knives? Cleaver, yes. He brought his cleaver with him, and he's about to set fire or torch some sugar canes, I think. Here is actually an early photograph of a cane hauler on a hacienda. And then here is something that Rafael Ocasio shared with me, because when he was showing this yesterday, the maquillas, the cigar boxes, I don't know how many have noticed the Chinese coolie right here. So, and it's an ingenio or a plantation with a coolie labor. So here's a table that you have a copy of, and you will notice that in 1866, with the last shipment of slaves into Cuba, the numbers of coolies imported to Cuba just exponentially increased. And you will notice that the production of sugar will continue to rise through these difficult years. Now, obviously, I'm not going to say that Chinese coolie labor made the production of sugar possible all by themselves, but it was certainly one of the significant factors that helped the Cuban planters maintain their high production of sugar. Now, most of these Chinese workers came from one part of China, from the Guangdong province, and some of them from Fujian province, just to the northeast coastal provinces. And you will see that not only did they come from the coastal province, but the vast majority of them came from a few counties in Guangdong province. Here's Guangdong City, a canton, and these few counties. And you will see its proximity down the Pearl River Delta to both Hong Kong and especially to Macau for our story. And these are the same sending counties that sent Chinese workers to the railroads in the California West and all over Canada as well, to the Caribbean and to South America. An extraordinary story of migration. So now, why recruit from this area? First of all, coastal peoples of China were already familiar with going overseas. Secondly, in the Guangdong area, there had been tremendous social turmoil, such as the Taiping Rebellion, which had uprooted many people from the villages. But these hardy and hardworking villagers were also highly skilled agricultural workers who had developed for centuries the sericulture that had undergirded China's silk trade to the west, and not to mention the backbreaking work of wet rice cultivation, planting 2 or even 3 crops a year. Furthermore, they were also very familiar with sugarcane cultivation and technology, even exporting sugar to America in the 18th century. The hot weather of South China and Cuba were also quite comparable. In other words, Cubans could not have found a more ideal labor pool to draw from. You have copies then of the bilingual contracts, and I'm going to go through that with you, showing you the highlights and comparing the Spanish and the Chinese versions. Because again, I think these are unique documents, these bilingual documents. Technically, of course, these contracts testify to the central role taken by the colonial states in organizing, regulating, and supervising what was an indenture labor system. The formal contract of indenture was technically a civil contract between equal parties, the contracting agent in China, the prospective labor migrant, with the obligations of each party clearly spelled out. Now you have then the copies, and if you look at the 2 versions of the Spanish contract, because I know that many of you speak Spanish. First of all, let me just show you this map first before I go into the contract. You see that the Chinese from that place in China that I mentioned, South China, recruited. If they were going to California, it's a straight shot against the Pacific, right? Here's China. And even to Peru, a straight shot against the Pacific. And this is a much shorter voyage than those who went to Cuba, because they decided that the easiest way to go from China all the way to Cuba was around South Africa and then up the Atlantic and into the Caribbean, a trip that sometimes took as long as 6 months. So it was an extremely arduous and difficult trip. Now, you don't have to look at the Caribbean. And these are the Yankee Clippers, which were among the most active ships that transported Chinese coolies to Cuba. Okay, so these are the copies of the contracts that you have. Okay. Overseeing this coolie trade was the, I say, grossly misnamed Comisión de Población Blanca, the Commission of White Settlement. which was an agency of the powerful Real Junta de Fomento y Colonización, the Royal Board of Development and Colonization, and it was presided over the Comisión by none other than one of the greatest sugar planters, Julian Zulueta, whose brother in the London office first went over to China to set up the trade. So this is a multinational corporation of sugar planters and sugar brokers throughout the world. And then in one of the versions of the Spanish contract, you will see that at the top it says, and this is very significant, it says it's a libre emigración china para la isla de Cuba. It says it's an immigration contract. And because of that, the coolie was called a colono asiático, which I think the best way to translate it, and that's indeed how Cuban scholars translate it, is a settler. And so the settler, but they couldn't really keep the story consistent because the person who buys up his contract is called a patrono. A patrono, a patron, is an employer or a boss. So how can a settler have a boss or an employer? That's one issue. Now, some Cuban planters were much more honest and direct, and they talked about the need for brazos, which means an agricultural laborer. Interestingly enough, if you read Chinese, I know there's at least one person here who reads Chinese, that's Maggie Chow over there. You will see that in Chinese, it doesn't say anything about immigration or settlers. Because in Chinese, the contract very clearly says that it is a labor contract, 雇工合同 or 工作合同, which means clearly a labor contract. And the person who signs the contract is a 工人, a laborer, 工, and that he is going overseas, 出洋, but that in both of these contracts, it does very specifically say that the person is going voluntarily, 自愿, no? So in both cases, they stress a voluntary nature, but in one, it calls the coolie, the Chinese, an immigrant and a settler. In the Chinese document, it very clearly states that he is signing a labor contract and he's going in the capacity of a laborer going to work. Now, the contract terms are all quite similar and quite constant with slight variations over time. The 8-year term of servitude never varied. Wages of 4 to 6 pesos a month. Food was supposedly provided. Clothing supposedly provided. Medical attention supposedly provided. 3 days off a year supposedly provided. Sundays off except during the safra or the harvest. And the coolie pays his own passage by borrowing money. Now, I emphasize supposedly because, as you can imagine, most of these were never really honored. But still, it's important to note that these things were all put in place. Now, in Chinese, again, it's a more consistent because it talks about the worker, the owner, etc. Now, here are some of the terms. If you read Spanish and can read the tiny print, you will see some of these things spelled out. I'm obligated for 8 years to work in Cuba as determined by the contractor or whoever buys this contract for whatever kind of work, and goes on, no? And then here's important too. It says very clearly in the coolie, by signing the contract then uses the personal I, no? Because it's his contract. He says, I subject myself to the orders and rules and regulations of the establishment. I subject myself to the punishments and sanctions for failure to apply myself or failure to complete the task, failure to obey the boss, the patrono, or his representatives. And the last one is interesting. Or when the laws are not precise in determining the gravity of the situation. That is, it defaults to the planter to determine the punishment. Okay. This is in Chinese as well as in Spanish. It's also interesting that, on the other hand, the contract also says that aside from the rest time during work days, I cannot be made to work on Sundays more than what the nature of the work requires. And then the final section, the final clause that's in the contract, in most contracts says, I would be free to work as I wish without being forced to extend this contract, not even under the pretext of debt, obligations, or promises that I have made. This is significant because it acknowledges, at least in theory and in the contract, that the indentured laborer is fundamentally a free person. But soon things began to intervene. In 1949, I'll come back to some of these things. In 1949, a series of regulations was issued to further streamline how these coolies would be treated and managed. And in the 1949 regulations, it stipulated that whenever there were 10 coolies on any one estate, the planter must assign a white overseer to supervise them. Remember, these coolies were working alongside African slaves. Another stipulated that only the white overseer could mete out corporal punishment, which means that corporal punishment was permitted, but only the white overseer, meaning a black slave, could not discipline the Chinese coolies. What's interesting about this is that we begin to see already a recognition of tension between Chinese coolies and African slaves on the plantations, and an attempt to grapple with the situation and to mediate whatever possible conflicts might arise, and you can be sure that a lot has arisen. Already? Okay. Well, then I'm going to go and use my slides. One of the things that allowed that these also included, and this is very interesting, I find, and I will try to attempt to explain what I think is the significance of this. It says that at the end of the contracts in both Spanish and English, I declare that I accept the salary as stipulated, although I know and am informed that free laborers and slaves earn much more in Cuba. Meaning that once a coolie signs a contract and once he gets to Cuba and finds out that his wages are lower than what other people are making, he cannot renegotiate the salary terms of his contract. And we'll see the significance of this in a while. The other thing that the regulations allow that I want to mention very quickly, but I don't have time to go to, I have lots of examples of this, is that they provided for coartation. And we know from slavery that coartación or coartation is a possibility of buying out the rest of one's term. So they could buy out the rest of their contract if they had the means to do so. And indeed, I have found lots of petitions to buy out the contract. And the ones that succeeded, the few that I have found that succeeded, were those who won the lottery. And I don't have time to tell you about lottery winners, but lots of possibilities happen when you have money, even then as now. So, but the most significant changes was the one in 1960, as you will see from this list, okay? In 1960, the regulation was really far-reaching in that it required that coolies who had fulfilled their first 8-year contract must recontract indefinitely, which meant that they were to be kept in servitude indefinitely. And if they did not want to recontract, they were supposed to go back home on their own steam, at their own expense, which few of them could do. So guess what? Most of them ended up recontracting. But here is where things got interesting, because I examined batches of these recontracts, and I have included one of them for you. The recontracts were never of 8 years. They were of much shorter duration, as short as 3 months, usually 1 year, maybe at most 3 years, and they almost always entailed more pay, and the pay also varied from plantation to plantation and place to place. The other thing that started to appear, and this is a contract, the recontract that I gave you from the place called Guanohai, and it's between Vicente Ho and, let me show you, okay, Vicente Ho, do you see it? And the Chinese who had They both Hispanized the name, the Chinese. He recontracted with a Chinese. And you know why? Because you look at the bottom signature. Do you see the signature? Firma del patrono of the owner is Ling, except he was semi-illiterate because he didn't write the character correctly. But nevertheless, the colono also signed, and he was probably not literate, but he did know one character, one of the simplest characters in the Chinese language, a character for da, big. And that's what he signed. That's not a name, it's not a surname, but he signed it, no? So this is a recontract for only 1 year. And you can see that this is a typical recontract. Now, the significance of recontracting with the Chinese is also important because these free Chinese who have finished their first 8-year contract began emerging as enganchador or labor contract. Okay, so I'm gonna move on because I'm told my time is up. Now, I wanna finish with this final point, okay? This is a recontracting. Okay, the enganchador, the cuadrillos. What I want to look at is a question, and I'm not going to go into this, is whether these coolies were slaves. Lots of Cuban scholars in Cuba and outside Cuba all claim Pérez de la Riva, Jiménez Pastrana, Moreno Fraginals, and many of you heard their names, Rebecca Scott at Michigan, Denise Heli of Montreal. They've all debated this question. It's a very easy question to settle. In one way, were they slaves? Yes, they were treated like slaves, sometimes worse. And there's lots of testimonies to that effect, even from the Chinese themselves, thousands of whom testified to the Chinese government when they went to investigate the situation, this marvelous book called the Cuba Commission Report. But here's where the difference is, and I will conclude with this. I began to look at how the Chinese were actually deployed, what kind of tasks. And I began to look at plantation records, and let me conclude by sharing with you some of these plantation records, and I think you begin to see the differentiation. Differentiation already in the way they were able to negotiate the recontract. What I perceive in that is the appearance and the presence of a labor market at work. Labor was an acute problem in Cuba because, of course, slavery itself was being gradually phased out, and these planters were grappling with this issue. So let's look at, real quickly, Jiménez Pastrana, Moreno Fraginals, both conclude that while they were like slaves, they were not slaves, and more importantly, that the Chinese constituted an early step in the rise of our working class. Or in the case of Moreno Fraginals, the Chinese constituted the first step in solving the labor problem, which permitted the beginning of industrialization of sugar. In effect, the transition from manufacturing to industrial productions. So, here is Ramon de la Sagra, a Cuban planter who says on his plantation already in 1860, in the boiler room, which we've heard a lot about, there were 430 coolies to 252 slaves. In the purging room, the Casa de Purga, there were 250 coolies to 28 slaves. But out there in the field, in loading and hauling cane to the ingenio, there were 189 slaves and only 35 coolies. So you begin to see that the coolies were being assigned to the sugar house or the ingenio where the skilled and semi-skilled labor was done. That's one. Secondly, let me show you, this is Manhattan Ripley. How many of you read her wonderful, wonderful book, From Flag to Flag? This is a southern planter lady who went with her husband from Louisiana to Cuba where they owned a plantation. And we've heard lots of plantation names these last few days. Well, they named this Desengaño, which means disillusionment. I wonder what that means. And here also she talks about the Chinese working in the sugar factory, in the carpenter shop, in the cooper shop. And so again, apparently more skilled work. And finally, one more right here close to home. The Massachusetts family, Atkins family, also went to Cuba and owned the state called Soledad. And there are a series of exchanges in the Massachusetts Historical Society. I know David Singerman knows about this because we talked very briefly about this. The correspondence between the owner Atkins, and he talked about the Chinamen were particularly suited for work in the sugar house, in the boiler house, in the centrifugals, and here we go, in the defecators, and this is not a typo. So, What is a defecator? I know we heard from Lewis Nelson another meaning of defecate, but this is the other meaning of defecate. Defecators is sugar huge vats to purify the guarapo or the cane syrup by applying heat and skimming off impurities. So on that high note, I leave you. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you all for great papers. My question is for Professor Nelson. And I was really interested in your idea of kind of the rise of surveillance plantation in the 18th century. Kind of temporally that lines up with how a period in which some people talk about the rise of division ground on the Jamaican plantation as well. And some historians have written about division ground places by slave autonomy and detachment from the plantation. So I was just wondering if your work and your engagement with this work suggested any sort of relationship between the surveillance, plantation, and division ground that practically relevant.
Sure. So thank you very much for the question. The question centers around the corresponding rise, if in fact there is one, of surveillance over the course of the 18th century and the emergence of provision grounds, maybe in some ways in response to that. And I would say I don't know that there's a clear distinction, a clear relationship between the two. I also think it's important for us to keep in mind that the perception of surveillance on the part of the planter is not actually always the reality of surveillance as it's been, would be experienced. So it's important for us to kind of keep those two things distinct. So I don't really know. You're absolutely right that they correlate temporally. Maybe Jillian would also have some insight there. She's done an awful lot of work also on villages and provision grounds. I don't want to put Jillian on the spot, but if there's other things that you might have to say.
A colleague of mine mentioned her PhD had was working specifically on surveillance, a major GIS analysis of over 50 classes in Jamaica, looking at fusions and sightlines and demonstrating that surveillance is in fact plantations are set up for maximized production, not maximize surveillance. And the provision grounds in particular are often in the most marginal landscape, far removed from overseers' houses,
Right.
great houses, where they really aren't able to be monitored. So I
Right.
think it was your comment about the perception
Right.
of a planter's ability to survey the landscape.
The sort of, potentially even the sort of, it's a self-delusion that in fact surveillance is actually happening in an increasingly contested landscape, when in fact the reality is that it's really not, is probably the key point.
My question is a two-part question for President Hu-DeHart. Were there any Chinese women brought over to Cuba? And then secondly, did any of these Chinese coolies, did they have any relationship with female African slaves? And if so, where are they descendants?
With female what?
African slaves.
Oh, well, there were a tiny handful of women who somehow got over there, but for all practical purposes, during the 25 years, there were no women to speak of. But again, because they were on the plantations with African slaves, and there were women, relationships did form, and here the lottery comes in again. Because I found cases of Chinese, they all played the lottery. That's one thing the Chinese and the Cubans had in common. In fact, the Cubans loved the Chinese lottery so much they gave up their own lottery and played the Harada China. You might have heard about it. They used the Chinese lottery. If you win the lottery, not only African women, but I found a case of a local white woman, Doña Crescencia Perez, who was willing to marry the Chinese coolie, who then promptly baptized and bought out his contract, the coartación. So these things did happen, but of course, not very frequently.
Thanks. I love the panel. It's really terrific. I have one very quick question and one longer question for Professor Hu-DeHart. First is that you mentioned that these particular counties in China were ones in which there's a lot of experience traveling abroad for work. And I wonder whether the people who went to Cuba themselves had experience traveling abroad for work. In other words, whether it's sort of their second trip abroad, and if so, where they might have gone. And the second thing is that I noticed that in the contracts, there were a couple of provisions where
whatever it is, right? That's all very well and good, but it's not exactly kind of enforceable, right? You need someone to say, I signed the employer to sign a contract saying I will not be unemployed, whatever it is. I noticed people who, on the Cuban side, have been signing contracts were not planters themselves, but agents. And so I wondered whether there were contracts between, and what kind of contracts were between planters and agents, and then if there was if the contract was broken, what the sort of adjudication process was like, whether planters sought remuneration from agents, etc.
So the first question has to do with the previous migratory patterns of labor in the Pearl River Delta, and the second question has to do with the enforceability and adjudication of labor contracts.
Right. Well, those are great questions, and I'll just give you some brief answers because there are lots, the answer would entail a lot. Simultaneously, late 1840s, 1850s, the Chinese were being recruited to California for the mining first and then for railroads. And then shortly afterwards, they were being recruited to Australia. So this is a simultaneous thing. However, they had already been going to Manila since the 16th century. So when I say familiar, I mean the general culture of the region. People were familiar. I'm not saying that any of them, this is a second tour of duty or they have been over and come back. However, and since you asked, here's the important thing why I think the Chinese version of the contract, the language was adjusted. The Chinese were themselves not familiar with the concept of immigration. That was not yet developed. They were familiar with the concept of Chuyang, going overseas, but the idea was a sojourning mentality. You go overseas for a while, make a living, make a fortune, work, and then come home. You're always supposed to come home. Now, our Western notion of immigration is what? You go someplace else and you stay there. No? So those are very different concepts. So all I'm saying, David, is that there was a sojourning or a leaving culture that was familiar to people. Then how the contracts were enforced. I think for the interest of time, why don't I talk to you afterwards, lady, because there's not enough time for other people to get questions. Can we do that, David, and anybody else who's interested? Because those are very complicated questions. Yeah, I'm sure there are lots of questions.
Can I just ask the four people to sort of throw that out, and then we'll have the panel try to start. So we'll start with the gentleman here.
My question is Lydia. Would you like to comment on the work that's laid on with the artifacts in Collective 1, and 2, what sort of issues would you for the Montserrat and the Alston scattered abroad as they are in various places?
Oh, well, that actually.
Let me have all four questions put on the table, and then we'll get respond.
Mine is actually just more of an invitation to think of the whole global context about migration and definitions of realism on various periods of time, because the chronology as laid out in the panel would include the beginning and then the ending of convict labor in Australia. It would include migration
was just going to save some time by coming up here. I actually wondered in the two locations where you have two groups of people interacting, so both in Cuba and Puerto Rico, do you see examples where there's any kind of cooperation in terms of rebellion, or is there a resistance to cooperation? But then I want to get to Professor Pulsipher's question of resistance to resistance as well, so contradiction there.
All right, so now we're going to really put our panel to the challenge. Each of you, say something and say it quickly, and then we'll adjourn for coffee.
Jamaican plantations did distill rum.
Rum was used in Montserrat for many things. Not rum, molasses was used in Montserrat for many things. Medicinal, feeding babies, all kinds of things. The artifacts, 20,000+ of them remain to be processed. I'm working on it. I need help. The diaspora in Montserrat, the good things and bad have happened to them. The children got placed in a grade lower than they deserved to go into in Britain, and then a few months later they were promoted a grade above where they should have been. But now their behavior has deteriorated, their learning skills have deteriorated, this is the gossip, and now they're at, normal, obstreperous English kid level. And on the matter of resistance, it just seems to have this sort of pouting quality to it that doesn't really capture the complexity of the life that was constructed in many situations, not just at Galway's. And I just kind of think we haven't found the right word yet to cover how slaves reacted to this terrible enslavement and went beyond it to make a place for themselves in the New World tropics.
In the case that I have studied, there are many instances throughout the 19th century up until about the 1850s of slave conspiracies in Puerto Rico in various locations. Very few of those involve people who were not enslaved. It has to be said, however, that as there is a process of sort of common proletarianization, very early on after emancipation, there will be joint action at the level of the workplace and at the level of strike activity. Of course, one doesn't think of that necessarily as slave resistance, but as more working class resistance, and that does occur throughout.
And last word for Evelyn.
That was one section I didn't have time to cover, but if you're interested, just email me and I'll send you my paper. But this is a great story for Cuba because all during this time, the Cubans were fighting for independence. And the Coolies says, hey, if independence means the end of slavery, we're going to fight with them too, because it's going to mean the end of this horrible, torturous situation for us. So the Chinese, many of them joined the ranks of the Mambises, okay? Because the Mambises, the Cuban, were for freedom fighters. And it's really interesting because I think some of these Chinese who actually led freedom fighter, commanded battalions of freedom fighters of Mambises probably had experience in China with the Taiping Rebellion, which was coming to an end in the 1850s, because they were really good commanders. So that is a terrific story, and maybe one of the best stories in the Americas of joint efforts for freedom.